Sugarcane plantations were a lucrative and fast-growing business during the early 19th century. Before the Civil War, Louisiana's sugarcane plantations produced a quarter of the world's exportable sugar. This was credited to the gross amount of free labor many plantation owners received from imported African American slaves. In 1830, about 52 slaves labored on the average plantation, and by the Civil War in 1861, many had more than 100 slaves. By the eve of the war, Louisiana's sugar industry was one of the most profitable agricultural regions of the country. The Louisiana Great River Road is actually two roads, separated by the Mississippi River. It stretches nearly 100 miles between Baton Rouge and New Orleans and spans through the parishes of St. Charles, St. John the Baptist, St. James, Ascension, Iberville, and parts of East and West Baton Rouge. Dozens of sugar and cotton plantations once lined both sides of the River Road. Before the Civil War, storms, levee construction, and economic depressions either destroyed or forced owners to shut down. Currently, there are 12 plantations in the southeastern River Road region that are open to the public for tours.
When cotton was king, or shortly thereafter, sugar became queen. At one time, Louisiana was the #1 producer of sugar. Ascension Parish and St. James Parish produced more sugar in the world than any other country. The sugarcane plantations required a much larger workforce than any other plantation, cotton plantation or tobacco plantation. America wouldn't be what it is today. Europe wouldn't be what it is today. Because if it had not been for that free labor, the economy would not have thrived worldwide during that period. My name is Kathy Hambrick Jackson, and I am the founder and director of the River Road African American Museum. And I started this museum because I realized that there was no interpretation of slavery or the contributions of Africans and African Americans in this region that is known as Plantation Country, South Louisiana. There is an interest now in knowing what happened to the people after emancipation. And I think that is a big part of the interest in what we do here to interpret the history. We do a disservice to the state of Louisiana when we, as tour operators, historians, and educators, when we do not give the visitors who come here an accurate or a more well-rounded story of what the history of this region is all about.
The Laura Plantation is situated on the Great River Road between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. The plantation complex is located just upriver from the West Bank community of Vacherie, Louisiana. The plantation is known for its unique Creole plantation big house and long line of women owners. Its collection of outbuildings, including 6 slave quarters, illustrates the development of a sugarcane plantation from the antebellum period well into the 20th century. It was built in 1804 and is informally known as Wagasback Plantation. It is the oldest surviving plantation in St. James Parish.
On an average day, we probably do about 15 or so tours. In the peak months like the spring, we'll probably do as many as 20 to 25 a day. We're very fortunate to have the 12 buildings here on the National Register, and because the Laura wrote her memoirs, I think that's what really sets this place apart, because it's the stories that make this tour very interesting. Laura's plantation house is not a big, grand, glorious mansion. It's kind of an older colonial house, but I think the stories bring it to life when people relate to what they hear, whether it's Laura's family or some of the slaves. Nowadays, everybody's into reality shows, you know. Nobody cares about the antiques and the hoop skirts as much as they used to. So when you can tell these stories about actual people, because a lot of the underlying morals or principles that you can get from these stories are still applicable today. My background is mostly through genealogical research. I do genealogy research. I'm the president of the Research Society of New Orleans. and the webmaster of the German Acadian Coast Historical Society. So over the past, since I'd say 15 years or so, I've been doing a lot of research in genealogy. Well, here at Laura, we have a certain amount of information that every tour guide has to say during their tour. So we have a script that's about 18 pages long. But I always train the tour guides, if they don't know the answer to a question, tell the person, if the tourist comes and they ask a question you've never heard before, say, I don't know the answer to that, but when we go back to the front, when we finish the tour, we'll find somebody else that knows. So we don't ever want to give out wrong information. We don't want to make up an answer just to satisfy somebody. We want to get the correct answer. Well, we have lots of information, and it comes from a variety of places. First of all, Laura lived to be 101 years old. She's whom the plantation is named for. When, in the 1930s, for her children, she wrote down all that she could remember about growing up on the plantation. Her children had just got finished reading the book Gone with the Wind, and she took a look at the first chapter and she says, it wasn't like that for me. So she started writing down in her 70s. It took about 5 years, and she wrote her memoirs. But she started with her great-grandparents and the 4 generations of the family that lived here before her, and she took through each generation their experiences. And of course, a lot of the stories came from when she was growing up as well, but she also reflected back from stories that her mom and dad told her and her grandmother. And a lot of those stories do have interaction with the slaves and with the workers on the plantation. And on top of that, we've gone through the notarial archives to the courthouses. We've did interviews of people that used to live here, both the Wagaspack family and the former families that descend from the slaves. So we've amassed information from lots and lots of resources. Well, the tour has a big focus on the slavery aspect, because without the slaves, there's nothing here. I mean, this plantation was built on the back of the slaves. And visitors, even those who had been here before the fire, told us how much they enjoyed the tour, to hear kind of the balance between both the slaves and Laura's family. And so as the house was finished in 2006, after the restoration of the fire, we decided that we would keep the tour focused on both Laura's family and the slaves. So today, if you come on a tour at Laura, you're going to get both sides of the story, because Laura wrote so many stories down about her family's interactions with the slaves. We really have a lot of information. For example, when Laura was a little girl, one day she was playing by the well behind the house, and one of the old black guys who worked on the plantation came to bring his mule to get a drink of water, and his name was Pa Philippe. Well, they called him Pa because he was 72 years old. It was a nickname. But Philippe had worked on the plantation all of Laura's life, and she knew him really good, but before that day, I guess she had never been that close. So when Philippe lifts his hat to get the water from the well, Laura noticed a scar on his face, and she says, Pa, what's that? What's that mark on your forehead? He says, Laura, child, don't you know when I was a child, that's where they branded me when I used to run away? So right there, it tells you that as a child, Laura probably was shocked to hear such a thing, and she actually didn't believe Philippe. And then when she went to tell her mom, she says, Maman, Philippe's lying. There's no way my grandma was so mean. And then that's when Laura's mom, Desiree, had to sit her down and say, look, Laura, there's people on this plantation that you love very much. We're never going to do anything to hurt you. But there's also people on the plantation that you love very much, and the older you get, the worse you find out. Okay? So these are the kind of stories that Laura wrote down. So Laura was obviously very truthful in what she heard as recorded as an older lady, but it's things that she goes back to hearing when she's a child. Now, did she write down everything? Maybe not, but we do tell those stories because we're not trying to sugarcoat anything here, and the people enjoy to hear the reality, the truth of what took place here. I think that anybody that can come here can get different things out of the tour, you know, so we're not trying to give you one viewpoint, or we're trying to force something down your throat. We tell you the stories, we give you the facts, and then you can interpret it as you want. So occasionally we have people that come by who grew up on the plantation. Maybe a lot of the ones that do come are not the ones from Vacherie, the ones that have moved away, and I guess they miss home and they want to come back, or they want to show the next generation, their kids or grandkids, where they grew up. So I think a lot of the ones that we've had in the past that came and were skeptical about what was being said here and actually came and did the tour, after they left, they kind of had a little bit of pride in the fact that the things that are being said here are sharing their history with the world. So the only feedback I've had is always positive from the people that come on our tours.
Okay, I was born in 1947 in the month of September on the Laurel Plantation. I never really worked on the plantation per se. However, um, my mother worked on the plantation, my mother and father. And so the time that I would be off, once I got to a certain age, because I didn't want to see her out there, well, then I went to her place, whatever, like Saturday or if I was off during a week of school. So I worked like that. The living conditions, at the time that we were living in those conditions, to us it was natural because we didn't have anything to compare it with. However, after growing up and being able to move around to New Orleans and Baton Rouge and then see how other people live, then we noticed how the living condition was in real bad shape as we were growing up. My father, he worked 7 days a week. And at that time, I had one store on the plantation, at the head of the plantation. They call it the company store or the Laura store. So everything that people on the plantation needed, that's where they bought. You know, their clothes, their food, their drinks, their shoes, whatever. And so we would go out there and buy the little bit that we could buy and bring back home. However, every 2 weeks, when our parents get paid, that's where they had to pick up the check at what they call the company store. So before they allow my parents to see money, they would deduct, quote unquote, what they had bought in those 2 weeks. Me being the oldest, a lot of time when payday came, my father sent me. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. I would share with them that I can to pick up my father's paycheck. Then one of them would take me in the office and he would share with me that, you know, your mother and your father owe this, your mother and your father owe this, your mother and father owe that. Now, with 2 weeks of work, my father working 7 days a week, 12 and 13 and 14 hours a day. When they finished, I'd bring home $28 sometimes, 2 weeks work. And then when I would get home, you know, my father, even though he went to the 3rd grade, he was pretty good with numbers. So he had it already figured out by the time I get back. And when he see that, at first he wouldn't share nothing with me, but I could see the look on his face. However, as I grew, I kept doing it. So as I grew, going to school and learning, then he would share something like, man, look at here, look at the difference. These people are lying. I don't owe them all that, but I really can't say nothing because I'm living in their house. I'm working on their job. And so that's the way it was, as far as that goes. Hopefully those days are over. However, it's not, in one way it's not a nice place to grow up in, and in another way it is, for the lack of a better word, a good place to grow up in. Because even though you're living in quote unquote miserable conditions, I'll never forget, not just my family, everybody on the plantation and the neighboring plantation and I'll never forget the family. I mean, it was family. And I'll never forget the values and the morals that were taught on the plantation. I don't think he could get that nowhere else.
I was born on a Laurel Plantation. My mother and father worked in the field, and I can recall one holiday break, I think Thanksgiving or Christmas, they allowed me to work in my mother's place for a week. I probably was about 16 or 17 years old, and my father was what you would say the head man on the plantation. So, you know, they'd pick us up in the morning on the cart, the horse and buggy, and me and my girlfriend, we worked the field for a whole week, cutting can. It was our first time and the first experience. And from that experience there, I knew I could never be a part of that generation or that workforce, because we would work from 7, there was breakfast at noon to eat, which we had to bring our own food, and back to work and get off at 5. You know, and we literally were, there was the tractor, can tractor would cut the can down because it was considered grinding, which was the harvest time for cutting cans. And the first day I thought I had died. But my mom and my dad made me give the next day to complete the task that I had promised them I would do, to give my mother a break from the field. Never again will I ever promise nobody I would be their replacement. That taught me a lesson. Education comes first. The Laurel Plantation has closed down. The Laurel Plantation now is a tourist attraction. It's right in our community. If you pass every day, there's busloads of people coming from different countries and things. They're excited about the plantations. Me, when I came back home 4 or 5 years ago, that's something that does not interest me. There's a house that was on the Laurel Plantation that my grandmother lived. They got it up for display. That's not the house my grandmother had. You know, like all picks up so nice and so pretty. No. But being